Good evening. Welcome to part 3 of our advisory board committee training. Today's training is going to be on intersectionality. So we actually have a short agenda today. We'll do our introduction like always. Then I will go through the framework of intersectionality and we will have just a short conclusion. So again, the goal of these series of trainings is to provide education and support to the advisory board committee. Or the ABC. The purpose of the trainings is to help ABC members learn best practices for participation in committee work. Today's topic focuses on intersectionality, how to identify how systems of power and oppression affect identity, and how to manage intersectionality in group work. So the first thing I want to do is really highlight Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw is she's still working. She's the one, the reason we bring her up is because she's the one who coined the term intersectionality. She's the one who created this framework. And we're going to hear from her in her own words in a few minutes. I have, of course, a video where Kimberly Crenshaw speaks about what intersectionality is and how she came up with the idea of it. She's a civil rights scholar. She is a key contributor to critical race theory and Black feminist legal theory. She's a human rights activist. She has a podcast, which actually I didn't know before a couple of weeks ago, called Intersectionality Matters. Her most recent upload was only a few weeks ago. So that's really cool. What I'll do is I'll send out a link later that has this link, which just links to her page on the Columbia Law School website, where she's faculty. So I'm going to play this. Let me know, stop me if it's not working, like if you can't hear it or for whatever reason, but we're going to go through this. It's much better to listen to Crenshaw in her own words.
So intersectionality actually came out of my effort to think about how to create a word picture so that people could understand what happens when the kind of inequality that they're prepared to deal with overlaps or has an encounter with a kind of inequality that they're not committed to, haven't even thought about, don't experience it themselves, and don't necessarily feel called upon to be present in that. Intersectionality is also a frame. It's a frame that gives us a greater sense of how certain social problems come about, and importantly, what needs to be rethought in terms of the conventional interventions that we create for those inequalities when those interventions come out of narrow or non-intersectional frames. I came across a case that featured a woman named Emma DeGraffenreid. She was actually representing an entire group of Black women who were seeking better employment opportunities at an auto manufacturing plant in the Midwest. She was a wife, she was a mom, she was working class, she was really hoping to advance her family's well-being by seeking a different kind of job than the ones that typically were set aside for a woman like her. A job as a domestic worker or a job as a janitorial engineer. These were the kinds of jobs that were underpaid and that were usually without benefits. They weren't the kind of job that would allow you to actually entertain middle class aspirations. So she was trying to get one of those better manufacturing jobs. So she applied for the job, and like other Black women, she was denied. After her denial, she sued the employer, claiming race and gender discrimination. Now, the judge that heard Emma's case dismissed her suit. And he dismissed her suit because the employer in question had, in fact, hired African Americans and the employer had, in fact, hired women. From the court's vantage point, the fact that they'd hired African Americans and had hired women meant that they did not engage in race discrimination and they didn't engage in gender discrimination. Now, the fact that the African Americans they hired were not women and the women that they hired were not African Americans didn't defeat the argument that these women were unable to prove discrimination because the employer had hired blacks and had hired women. So, from the court's vantage point, the problem was that for Emma to be able to say, I was discriminated against, she had to say, I was discriminated against as a black person who's a woman. I was discriminated against as a woman who's a black person. That's what she would have had to say. And the court thought that the law didn't allow her to combine these two causes of action into one. But the fact that no judge ever stopped to think, well, why is this not a symmetrical disability? How come a white class plaintiff can represent all women even though there are differences within them, but a woman of color can't represent everyone? And the same with respect to men. So what we had here was a problem of the belief that women of color were a category in and of themselves. They could not represent themselves on their own, nor could they represent all women or all men. And this is the moment when I really started thinking about pre-existing schemas. You've heard about the story about the father who rushes his son to the hospital who's had an accident, and the surgeon begins to operate and then realizes, oh no, I can't, it's my son. And everyone's stumped by this. How can the father rush him to the hospital? And the surgeon says, he's my son too. Until it hits you, duh, the surgeon is a woman. But that it takes that extra moment for it to lock into place. Now, just add into that race, class, any other kind of schema that takes even longer for it to lock in, that your pre-existing assumptions about who this person was were all wrong. That's the space for intersectionality.
Right. So first we're going to talk about, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about intersecting identities. So the left side is a list of the side is a list of all different possible identities. And by the way, I'm sure there are many more ways that people can identify. So we're just going to talk about the big ones, right? The ones that we always think about first: race, ethnicity, language, class and status, gender identity and gender expression, sexual identity, ability or disability status, and religious beliefs. So on the right-hand side are some examples of where intersecting identities might, what an intersecting identity might look like. So cisgender is a term for somebody who identifies with the same gender that they were assigned at birth. So if you were assigned at birth female and you still identify as female, that makes you cisgender. And so we have a cisgender Black woman with diabetes, right? So being cisgender is a part of her identity that maybe she doesn't think about a lot, right? Because a lot of people who are cisgender don't think about that as part of their identity. They just, it's a more normative way of thinking. Whereas somebody who's transgender, obviously that might be a bigger part of their identity um, because it is not the societal norm. But maybe being Black is really something that she has had to struggle with from day one, meaning in terms of power struggles. And maybe something, maybe diabetes is newer, right? Maybe she developed diabetes later in life. And so, you know what I mean? So like that might be a newer challenge that she's dealing with that may be overshadowing being a Black woman, right? So this is what an intersecting identity means, is that there's different parts of you that, as Crenshaw said, like you may or may not always think about, what all of these identities really mean. And there may be some things that this cisgender Black woman with diabetes, other identities that she may have, that we're not even noticing right now. So another example is a transgender white man. Another might be a cisgender lesbian white woman with bipolar disorder, right? A cisgender Hispanic Jewish man. They do exist. Somebody who's maybe Spanish speaking or has that part of their identity, and is also Jewish, right? Like that has that part of their identity. They may have different unique challenges than some of these other identities that we've talked about. And then the last one is a cisgender undocumented Hispanic gay man who speaks Spanish as a primary language, right? And so um, there are clearly lots of ways to look at your identity, and they may or may not always be something that you're thinking about. They may or may not always be something that you feel is affecting your life, but they all exist, right? They all exist simultaneously. So now we're going to talk about the difference really between intersecting identities and intersectionality, right? So intersecting identities is just like these are the different parts of you, right? Intersectionality, though, addresses how the intersection of a person's identities is culturally and systemically weaponized to oppress them on multiple fronts and is directly connected to generational trauma. And so I just want to make sure that I give credit, because the quote that the little definition that I just read is actually from the Oregon.gov, and the um, image on the other side of the slide is from the University of British Columbia. So I'm going to make sure that I give credit where it's due. And I love this image, right? And in terms of this wheel, right? And so like each sort of slice of the pie is a different area of identity, right? Skin color, citizenship, gender, those are all different types of identities, right? And then on the inside of the wheel, you have sort of the, um, you know, who, which of these, which type of identity is going to be the one that has the power. And then the outside are, as you work to the outside, you become more, the identity becomes more and more marginalized. Right. And so there's lots of ways that we can look at this. And so, like even neurodiversity, I think a lot of people don't really think about this a lot, but neurodiversity is something that's really, really important, right? So you may have somebody in the middle who is neurotypical, right? Then there's somebody sort of in the in between space where it says some neurodivergence. So maybe somebody who has ADHD, but they can take medication and it's easily managed or something. And then you have significant neurodivergence. So that might be somebody with like who's on the autism spectrum who has a lot harder time navigating societal and cultural norms. And so these are all sort of parts of the, I love this wheel. I'll probably use this again one day because I think it really does a good job of um, clearly identifying the different areas that people can feel marginalized over. And we'll notice too, like thinking about those people in the middle, right? Um, how, people in power don't always often notice that part of their identity. It's not as obvious to them all the time, right? Because you just sort of blend in. It's the normative, the normative uh, identity in the culture. So, gender, citizenship, skin color, education, ability, sexuality, neurodiversity, mental health, body size, housing, wealth, and language. And so these are a more complete list than what I had in that last slide as well. So here's the danger zone, right? And this is where it matters in group work, right? Is a lot of times what you have is, I love this term oppression Olympics. So this sort of idea that you may be in a group setting with somebody and you may have um, competing identities that put you in a position of being more marginalized than some other people in the group. And so, um, having that knowledge, having that experience may sometimes lead people to almost compete for who's the least powerful in the room, right? Like you have more privilege, you have more power, and those kinds of, and it's that's why they call it the Olympics, right? You're competing for who has the least amount of power, and that finger pointing, that way of looking at it is can be really problematic in a group setting when your mission and your focus are you're all going in the same direction, your goals are really the same. It can cause conflict, and really what you're doing is you're not keeping your eye on what the real issue is, right? The ways in which the system causes continues to cause and compound um, the marginalization, and so we should be working together, noticing those differences, right? You want to notice those differences, you don't want to ignore them. Recognizing the ways we have power and the ways that we have privilege, and also acknowledging the ways that we don't, and doing the same for others is really, really important. um, I kind of skipped over it, but the who am I question, right? So when you have competing identities, I think Crenshaw kind of talked about this towards the beginning of that video, is, you don't always even notice in yourself. And then when something comes up, right, like, oh my gosh, that's a part of my identity I've really never thought about before. And sometimes you can have competing identities, right? Like the example that Crenshaw uses, the legal case where there was a suit, and it was, are you suing as a Black person? Are you suing as a woman? And I think a lot of times, like we hear this sometimes too, like Black women, and this is a crux of Black feminist theory. There's a lot of conversation in Black feminist theory about that when Black women speak against Black men, they're seen as like race traitors. And when they speak against white women, they're seen as traitors to their gender. And they're sort of stuck in this middle place. And so that can be competition. It can be really hard to be in that space. Um, and as I said, going back to the oppression Olympics, like if you're doing all of that work, a lot of times you're avoiding the key issue. And what is the key issue, right? Is really challenging systems of power and authority that cause long-term uh, inequalities, inequities to various populations. My apologies if you hear a dog barking and a giggling child around. Okay. So how do we sort of overcome these pitfalls? So one of the things we talked about a couple of weeks ago was implicit or unconscious bias. So really being as aware as possible of what your biases are. And I put in parentheses here, or conscious bias. Sometimes we like awaken to this idea, like, oh gosh, like I have this unconscious bias, and you have awakened to it now. And so sort of making sure that we're continuing to be aware of that. It's like really hard to always be constantly battling it, but at least being aware of ways that you may be bringing that bias to group work. Don't compete. Let that go. Let's recognize the role that oppression plays in all of our lives, and work together to resist the temptation to win at the oppression Olympics. We should be trying to find common identities, right? And build on those experiences, right? Where are the areas that we do have in common? Let's share those experiences and let's build them up. And then also, as I mentioned, accept and even embrace the ways you're different. It's okay for everybody to sort of, it's more than okay for everybody to be different, but it's okay to notice the ways we're different, acknowledge the way that power um, has affected the lives of the people around you and your own, and acknowledge that that might be different. Find ways that you have privilege and power and use that to your group's advantage, right? So um, this is like leveraging resources. If your privilege is your resource, use it, right? You're still all going in the same direction. You still all have the same goals in mind. So if you find a way that you have some privilege, if you find a way that you have some power, use it. Don't be don't be embarrassed to use it for good, right? Um, Show compassion and empathy. And this brings me back to, again, a few weeks ago we talked about what empathetic listening looks like. So showing compassion and empathy is really important to people around you. Taking that time to stop and really acknowledge what people have been through, um, and um, and really show them that you hear them, that they're heard. It's really, really important. So today we talked about being aware of intersecting identities, how intersectionality interacts with the system of oppression, and how to use this framework to improve group productivity. And that is vital to what all of this has been about the last few weeks, has been creating an open and trusting group environment. Thank you.